If Leah saved my marriage with TaskRabbit, I think Reddit almost ruined it a couple of times, right? So please welcome Chris Lowe, CTO and founding engineer of Reddit. And one interesting thing, I think he has a PhD in experimental physics. So I guess there's something that's coming into play with Reddit and virality and getting hooked there. I don't know what's happening. All right, give it up for Chris.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for letting me be the only thing standing in between you and lunch. Hopefully, I can either make this fast or interesting, or maybe both, if it works out. And yeah, I actually do have hey, nice to be here. I'm going to talk about rebuilding Reddit, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. Quick intro about me. As Lloyd said, I have a PhD in experimental physics, which I clearly use every day. And I'm also Reddit's founding engineer, which is a fancy way of saying that at one point I made a career choice to work entirely for pizza. That's mostly worked out, but at the time it didn't seem like a good one. I was actually the first employee at Reddit, which means that this topic is very near and dear to my heart because a lot of the things we've had to do to rebuild Reddit were mostly originally my fault. And so having come back in 2015 and now being CTO, that means the things are still my fault, just a different set of them. So before I go into what we did, I have to ask the question, of course, who here actually uses Reddit? All right, it's pretty good. Thank you all. I'm obligated, much like the safety video before an airplane ride, to tell you what Reddit is. So I'll open with that. So Reddit is kind of the front page of the internet. That was our original tagline. It's kind of stuck around. What it's evolved into is into a social network where there's a network of basically communities who can talk about, where the users can actually talk about their passions and interests. And that runs the gauntlet from things like makeup addiction to Westworld. So we have giant communities around topical areas like science and politics. And really, the focus of Reddit is on the conversation. And so, with that in mind, one other thing that people don't realize is we're kind of a big deal. We're like the biggest little site no one's ever heard of. We're usually in the kind of the fourth spot on Alexa these days. I'm glad they finally fixed their algorithm. And we have about 350 million monthly active users. And so that kind of comes out to being about 1 million communities, about 10 million posts per month, and about 58 million votes per day. So it's a lot of throughput to deal with. And our goal as a product is to bring community and belonging to everyone. And so the fun part about having to do a redesign for something like Reddit is that we literally have to build something that appeals to everyone. It's so simple. We'll get there. So I really want to talk about the problems that go into rebuilding Reddit. And so the first problem is that Reddit has a very specific, finely tuned aesthetic, which is usually referred to as dystopian Craigslist. And this isn't a really great launching point for everyone. I think a lot of users come in and they just see a wall of text and they're like, what am I looking at? And they bounce. A corollary to that is that Reddit is actually a platform for criticizing Reddit. So whenever we do something, we have a giant community of people that tell us we're doing it wrong and how they would do it instead. The fact that, so here's a vintage picture of Reddit in 2006. This one was written back in Prototype.js, was the pinnacle of technology in JavaScript for the OGs in the room. Fast forward to our first redesign. This is in 2008. We switched up to jQuery. This was actually a project that I ran a lot of, which is a lot of fun. But kind of fast forwarding another 10 years, and there's not really that much that changed. We had a very long time where we added some more things, like there's more buttons. More buttons is probably good. And there's a little bit more clutter. But I think this was a tough thing to change. And so we decided to start with kind of a slightly easier problem, which is, well, if we have to redesign Reddit, let's start by designing on a platform we don't actually have, which in this case was mobile apps. So we actually didn't have mobile apps until the start of 2016. We have a whole ecosystem of third-party apps, which has been tremendous. The fact that people actually would build an entire product based on our API is pretty flattering. And so we basically, we sat down and we built some new ones, and we had a chance to have a clean slate and actually build Reddit in kind of a modern look. And it was actually, they were very well received because there's nothing to compare to that we had ever built. But the users kind of noticed. So here's a picture of what they thought of the mobile app versus the website, which is very flattering for the mobile app. Don't get me wrong. And we worked really hard on that mustache. You know, so the kind of next related problem is that Reddit, in its current form, is really special to millions of people. And they don't trust us not to screw that up. You know, they have an aesthetic. They have an aesthetic sense. And here's an example of a common thread where everyone's replying nice except for the guy who lowercased it. And, you know, screw him. Breaking the streak. So the other issue really is, and this is a kind of sensitive topic, is this prior art as where things can go terribly wrong. So this is Dig. Dig was one of our major competitors in the early days. We were always the underdog to Dig. We had a friendly kind of competition going on. And they did a major overhaul and redesign in late 10, which, you know, they basically cleaned up the UI, added some more functionality. They changed their product a little bit, changed their back end. And the terrifying thing about that is just over the course of 4 months, if you kind of zoom in, you can see the scores are a lot smaller. And unfortunately, that correlated directly to traffic. And so basically, it didn't land very well. And so there's a kind of a persistent fear among our users that we're going to do roughly the same thing. Where are they going to go? And on top of it all, keep in mind that whenever our users decided to sign up, it was perfect for them. Like there was something special about Reddit. We have a very kind of steep learning curve to actually get to use the site. So if you're actually going to go through the effort of picking a username and going on from there, something hit you and something resonated with you. So with that kind of in mind, I'm primarily a technologist, or at least I try to be. I'm increasingly discovering though that the T in CTO actually stands for therapy, but it's kind of part of the job. It's meta engineering. What we had to do first off is on this redesign and rebuild, actually have a chance to modernize the stack. We're talking about a web app that was basically roughly 10-year-old jQuery. So we had an opportunity to actually use modern technology as part of it, and we had to do it in a way that was actually kind of careful. So to start with, we decided to attack our mobile web experience. So mobile web, this is actually a screenshot of the previous mobile web. It looked really good on a BlackBerry, I should mention, and it was very functional there. Not so good on a smartphone, but it does what it needs to do. We have big fat buttons for fingers. It had smaller traffic. The first rewrite we did there was using React. It was an instructive disaster, but it did look actually much nicer, kind of using the mobile apps as a target to build against. And we had a chance to do a full 2 rewrites and kind of getting our feet wet with React, kind of learning the ins and outs. And that actually went a lot better for the sake of the rebuild. So we used this as our kind of jumping off point to start to think about redesigning the primary web experience. And what's neat about Reddit is the actual core functionality is very straightforward. And so we had a prototype. Hopefully this works. Oh, there you go. We had a prototype working after about 2 months of the first 30 or 40% of features. So we had listings, we had buttons, you could actually sort things. This is just a kind of a starting point. There's no voting arrows yet, but those are kind of easy to add. All the actual backend work is there. And the thing about this project actually was the team was actually really tiny. So to give you a sense of the scale of the company, at the time we started this in December of 2016, the entire company was 150 people, engineering being about half of that. And we had 2 engineers who basically, on what turned out to be like I would almost call it a lark, decided to give it a shot to actually start building the new web stack. We had it kind of on the list for priorities, but not that early. And once we saw this initial pass, we're like, well, we should just build an org around this. And so we kind of rapidly built out our design team. We built out a product org, hired a director to run this. Funny story about our director who manages this team. He came to us from Microsoft. And when he told his wife that he was going to come to Reddit, she immediately opened up her computer and typed in Reddit, looked at Reddit, looked at him, looked at Reddit again. REDDIT, you're going to Reddit? Leaving a wonderful job at Microsoft. It's worked out for him, but it was definitely a sale he had to make it home. And you know, the nice thing about doing this from the ground up with a new team was we were able to make very rapid technical decisions. And so, you know, I was talking to, when I prepped this talk, I was talking to the engineer who kicked this whole project off, and you know, he was thinking about what to do, and he said, with unlimited power, we would have picked a different language, but instead we decided on TypeScript in an hour, possibly over lunch. By mid-February 2017, it was working well enough that it was mandated to be the way. So in this case, we had basically 2 or 3 engineers spearheading a new language, a new set of requirements, and having it actually stick across the rest of our web org, which is very exciting. So user testing. So now we kind of have a rough cut of a product, and we get to start doing things like these wonderful kind of waterfall-y, like how are we going to roll this out? And you know, the gist of this graph I'm showing is actually very carefully was an important part of this. Our community cares a lot about its own integrity. Our users are very kind of gun-shy about us making drastic changes. And so making sure to do this in a way that was respectful, adding users slowly, and also in the process, actually, you know, building out a team to talk to users. So enter UX. We actually hired a user experience team from scratch. This is my first experience hiring user experience. And the interesting things about this was like actually talking to users one-on-one, we had a chance to not only talk to old users, but new users. And so for new users, it was typically things like, I don't know what I'm looking at. For power users, it was, why are you killing Reddit? And you know, hundreds of hours of video to kind of get people's impressions on what they were seeing in the new redesign. And you know, as part of that, of course, our avatar, Snoo, managed to get a full 3rd dimension, which was a very nice, nice part. And so you know, we had a whole bunch of issues, though. So there's kind of technology/design issues that come into play with Reddit. So Reddit having 10 years of history, our communities are able to style themselves and start to actually look in a particular, like, so here's an example of one of our communities that's very heavily styled. And you can see, like, it doesn't look like stock Reddit at all, and it's actually kind of a drastic change. And so the side effect of allowing our communities to do self-styling with CSS is anyone here who knows, you know, WebStack means you effectively lock in your DOM. Like once you've let arbitrarily many people write CSS against your DOM, you can't even add a div without screwing up somebody's style sheet. And so we had to come up with a way to do this kind of more programmatically. Also, this doesn't transfer onto the mobile apps at all. We can't run CSS inside of what's not a web view on a mobile app. And even then, we don't want to really require our moderators to have to restyle everything. So what we decided to do was build something called structured styles. It turns out, unsurprisingly, that CSS is really hard to write. And there was about 5 or 6 major kind of CSS packs that our user base had kind of accumulated over the years. And so we found the commonality of all the features they were actually using. And we built in some tooling to allow them to do it with kind of checkboxes and dropdowns. And you know, here's an early version of that. You can see it actually starts to get a little rich. It's not fully up to snuff of CSS because, of course, you know, CSF is a much sharper knife. But it kind of gets the job done. Another issue is white space. So Reddit, one of the things our core users love about Reddit is the fact it's so information dense. I think if you're showing this to a designer, I think the first thing they do is throw up in their mouth a little bit. And then they try to help, and by adding some padding so you can actually see what you're looking at. And our user base is like, no, why would you add padding? You're decreasing the information density. Reddit being the terminal interface to the web. And so what we decided to do was, well, we'll give them the option to actually set their padding. So we created 3 different views, all the way from the kind of full-blown modern card view with expanded images inline, down to what we called ultra-compact mode that our lead engineer on this was very proud to say actually had, on a typical screen size, 1 more story than the original compact view. So it was actually even more dense than the original one. So that kind of blunts that discussion. Now, of course, next thing is performance, right? So building a new stack from scratch, building it against our current API, there's going to be problems. In this case, we had issues with, we switched into a single page shell mode where the page loads effectively instantly, and then we do API calls to get the content. And the side effect of that is actually, even though you're using the same set of APIs, it feels slower to the user. And that's because Reddit being server rendered, when it takes a second or 2 to load Reddit, in a user's mind, it feels like, oh, it's network latency or some other kind of problem. It's not the server rendering. When the shell loads instantly, they're like, where's the content? And they actually get a chance to see it. And so what we had to start doing was to start measuring everything. Another kind of related thing is we got to make sure that since this is a much more rich, live, modern web app, the scrolling needs to be buttery smooth. You should be able to continuously scroll, get more content, and learning about how to do that properly in React has been a lot of fun. And so one of the things we did actually was build some tooling to actually keep track of reflows and repaints. So here you can see an early version where every time one of the elements blinks, it means that React decided it was time to do a reflow or a redraw. And as you can see, as a result, there's some stutteriness as like things start to relay out. And that's very noticeable to a user. You can have like a little kind of like 200 millisecond little jump. And so just with this tooling, we're able to kind of make it a lot cleaner really fast. So here's the next version of that, where you can see that basically nothing changes and nothing reflows. Much cleaner user experience. Finally, of course, this is Reddit. The conspiracies come up. We started doing some user testing. We rolled it out to a set of alpha users who we kind of trusted enough to tell us what they thought and not start leaking screenshots. And my favorite conspiracies was I still had performance issues after opting out of the redesign. This seems to be because anyone with using the redesign as an option in their preferences is sent to a version of Reddit which looks like the classic view but has the performance problems of the redesign. That's really clever. We didn't do that. But if we had, it would have been actually pretty funny. We ended up finding out what was wrong with that separately. There's another one where we were playing with ads at the same time, and they say, hey, 3 ads and 8 posts, this is a little ridiculous. And of course, we responded, sorry, we actually meant to have every single unit be an ad, which was well received as a response. But the nice thing about actually involving the community early is that they started actually doing work for us, because they're actually want to see things succeed. They want to see Reddit succeed. And so we had actual entire documentation and styling write-ups come just from users being helpful. From early versions of structured styling. So it gave us an opportunity to work on the technology and let our user base kind of self-organize the documentation, which was fantastic. So I think TLDR for all of these things is listen to your users. Like in our case, our users are particularly loud. But even in the cases of most sites, listen to their feedback. Don't always give them what they ask for, but at least listen to them. One of the other big changes here was being guided by data. So I should mention that part of Reddit's legacy stack was also a lot of missing elements of our analytics pipeline. We had a very bare bones pipeline, started like kind of pre-2015. Boils down to doing a giant MapReduce jobs against logs and generating graphs. Those graphs are actually very similar to the ones we still show on subreddit traffic pages to this day. We've changed the underlying technology. And so over the course of the last couple of years, we took our kind of very straightforward flowchart, and we added a whole bunch more boxes. This is kind of like adding a bunch of modern technology. So having a data pipeline involving Kafka, using Google BigQuery, we use it very heavily right now. Starting to actually build out dashboarding systems so that PMs and designers can actually figure out what users think of the features based on how they're using them. Very powerful. Now, in the case of a redesign, of course, it's very difficult to figure out if you've not made a mistake. You are really kind of comparing an apple to an orange, but you can find at least a couple set of core metrics to make sure that the engagement is still there. And part of that is also making sure that the metrics are being sent to the server, which seems easy, but actually tends to be really hard, especially on clients. And so one of the things we actually built is a little event debugger. So here's a new version of the stack, and we have a little pop-out when we're doing it in debug mode, where you can actually keep track of what's actually going to the server and actually look at the posts as they're happening live to make sure the pipeline is actually working and that they've actually added in proper metricing. And the nice thing is we get wonderful dashboards like this then. So here's our rollout happening kind of in real time, or at the time in real time, over the course of several days. And we can keep track of things like how many communities are being engaged with. Are users submitting content on the redesign? Are they voting on the redesign? And all of this was kind of a nice way to ensure that at least we could keep track of not breaking core functionality, work on the next set of features as we needed to. So, final reveal. I think we've actually kind of, at this point, rolled it out to a good fraction of our user base. But the kind of before and after picture is, it's different, but respectably different. I think this is the kind of most compatible view. There's actually a much more card view that you can choose with the selector up there. And of course, would love to thank the team. This is the entire redesign team. The engineer in the back with the hat was the guy who kicked us all off, Niranjan. And Anand up front is the director here. And just really a bunch of talented people getting a chance to watch them work and watch them learn how to kind of interact with the community live. And with that, I'd say thanks for having me. And you know, in general, we're also hiring, so keep that in mind. Thanks.
I need some traction. You need some traction. Let's get some traction.